Nichelle Nichols. This is episode 48.
You're listening to 70s Trek with Bob Turner and Kelly Casco, the fan podcast that looks at Star Trek in the 1970s. It was the decade that built a franchise.
In 1976, you might remember hearing hits like Shake Your Booty by Casey and the Sunshine Band. That one's for you, Kel. You Should Be Dancing by the Bee Gees. And Silly Love Songs by Paul McCartney and Wings. I'm Bob Turner.
And I'm Kelly Casto. 1976 was also the year Nichelle Nichols joined the Star Trek cast for the christening of the first space shuttle, Enterprise. This week on 70s Trek, we talk about Nichelle, her career, and her work with NASA.
But first, let's remind everyone how to reach us.
Sure. You can visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/70s Trek and leave us a question or a comment. We'd love to hear from our listeners.
We sure do. You can also send us an email to 70strek@gmail.com. And you can find the show on iTunes. Just search for 70s Trek in the podcast section. While you're there, please consider leaving us a rating or a review because it helps other people find the show. Nichelle Nichols first showed up on Gene Roddenberry's radar way back in 1964 in an episode of The Lieutenant. That episode was To Set It Right, and she played the wife of an African-American officer. Boy, and that led her to bigger and better things.
It sure did. You know, we all know her as Lieutenant Uhura, and she inspired more than one crush from young men growing up in the 70s.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. You can probably count me in there.
Yeah, me too, probably. Not probably.
Not probably. Well, let's get on with it then. Maybe we'll dig ourselves out of this hole. You know,
Hopefully.
you went and looked at her early life. Why don't you go ahead and start with that?
Right. Nichelle was born Grace Dell Nichols on December 28th, 1932 in Robbins, Illinois. That's a town near Chicago. Her father, Samuel, was a town mayor and a chief magistrate of the town.
He was the mayor?
Yes.
Oh, that's cool.
Yes.
That's like classic American, small town life. That's awesome.
Absolutely. And her mom's name was Leisha Parks Nicole. Her parents were a big influence in her life. They really encouraged her interest in singing and acting. And one case, she was auditioning, or she went to an audition at the Chicago Ballet Academy. And when she got there, the instructor informed them that blacks could not hope to undertake a formal study of ballet.
Ooh.
Now, her father was furious, obviously, and demanded that she be allowed an audition. With his support and her determination, she killed it.
Awesome.
And secured the right to attend the school or the academy. Now, as Nichelle recalls from her book, Beyond Uhura, Star Trek and Other Memories, she says, "It never occurred to either of my parents to feel inferior to anyone for any reason." And she says, "My father taught us, you are not better than anyone else, but there is no one better than you," which I really like that quote.
What a great story, too. To start off her career, talk about, instilling her with some determination and grit. You're going to push through this.
Right.
It doesn't matter what other people think. Go out and kill it.
Yep.
Great story. And what a shame, too, that wasn't that long ago.
It really wasn't.
No.
So she studied ballet from age 12 to 14. And during that time, she also studied Afro-Cuban dancing under Carmencita Romero. Ooh. Now, this study with Afro-Cuban dancing later led to of her first professional gig at the age of 14. And she was singing and dancing at the prestigious Sherman House Hotel, which I threw in prestigious because they did in my research. I don't know what the Sherman House Hotel is.
Let's just assume it was.
It was.
Yeah.
The important part is, though, while she was at the Sherman House, she was able to meet lots of big talents of the day, like Duke Ellington was a big one. Duke was so impressed with her that he later invited her, and then, this is a little bit later, her first husband, Foster Johnson, to join his touring company, and this was about in 1950. So that was kind of cool. She's touring with Duke Ellington and his orchestra, and
that's the top of the game at that time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pretty impressive.
1951, the birth of her first son, Kyle, forced Nichelle to slow down just a bit so she could support her son. She took an office job. Now, as you can imagine, she had a passion for singing, dancing, acting. So this really didn't last long. She wanted to get back on the stage. So she returned to the stage not too long after in Chicago, and she was on the nightclub scene there as a singer-dancer, specifically in the revue Calypso Carnival. So by mid-50s, though, she took her singing and dancing act on the road as a solo act, and she toured all over U.S. and Canada.
Wow.
Yep. And she did really well at this. She actually made enough money that she was able to move her whole family, parents and herself and her son, to L.A. To find work in film and TV.
Oh, good for her. Jeez.
So she made her film debut in 1959. She was an uncredited dancer in the musical Porgy and Bess. Now, this starred Sidney Poitier, Dorothy, Dandridge, and Sammy Davis Jr. So kind of a big movie.
Yeah, really.
She secured a role or an acting part in a new Broadway musical called Kicks and Company in 1961. And it's an Oscar Brown musical. And it was a story set on an all African-American college campus in the American South during the early days of desegregation. She played a lead role, Hazel Sharp. And get this, her character was being tempted by the devil to be Orgy Magazine's Maiden of the Month. Now, this fictional magazine was actually a satirical version of Playboy.
I was wondering if that's what it was. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So she would be like the playmate.
Right.
Gotcha.
Now, the play got some decent reviews, but it really had a very short run on Broadway. Now, the ironic part here is that her performance caught the attention of Hugh Hefner.
Hugh Hefner.
Yes.
Publisher of Playboy magazine.
Right. And so he booked her for several gigs in his Chicago and New York Playboy Club.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so she did that for a little bit. She also performed in Chicago and New York as well at the Blue Angel. So she was doing her singing and dancing thing again. But she wanted to get back into TV. So 1964, she went back to Hollywood and began working in TV. She did some things like The Lieutenant, Peyton Place, and Tarzan. Now, Nichelle's television debut was on The Lieutenant, and the episode, as you mentioned, Bob, To Set It Right. This episode looked at race relations in a very frank way at the time. So it was kind of a controversial episode, and for 1964 especially. It was written by Lee Cronin, which we know Lee Cronin as Gene L. Coon.
That's right. That's right. How about that Star Trek tie too?
Yeah. Yeah. And there were, as we've talked about, the Lieutenant had several other Star Trek alums and they weren't alums then.
Right, but I think Leonard Nimoy appeared in an episode. Majel Barrett appeared in an episode.
Right.
At times. So, yeah, the Lieutenant really is sort of a big feeder for Trek talent.
Right.
I think even the casting director was Joe D'Agosta, right? Didn't he? Yeah. He ended up working on Star Trek too.
Yeah, he did. And in The Lieutenant, he was it was really his first time as a casting director.
Well, now we know why a lot of these people went from The Lieutenant to Star Trek. It's as much as D'Agosta as it is Roddenberry's credit.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Scratching away. We're just scratching away at the facts.
Absolutely. Just keep digging. Now, while working on The Lieutenant, Roddenberry and Nichelle began they began a romantic relationship.
Not kind of. Kind of would be, hi, baby, how are you?
It's just a glancing passing there. But no, it was a romantic relationship, but it developed a long-lasting relationship with Nichelle and Gene.
Well, and I think what's indicative of that is the fact that he invited her to be on Star Trek afterwards.
Exactly.
So they had the affair, but then they became friends. And there's a little insight into Roddenberry that he could alter that relationship and become friendly.
Exactly.
I read somewhere too while we're talking about this that this happened while he's still married, and while he was also having another affair with Majel Barrett, who would become his second wife.
Right.
Gene was kind of busy.
Yeah. More ways than one.
I think so.
Now, in Beyond Uhura, Nichols states that she and Gene conceived and created the Uhura character. Together. And in fact, she was supposed to be a citizen of the United States of Africa.
Oh, wow. Really? So like a futuristic look at what Africa might become.
Well, exactly.
Interesting.
And then her name, Uhura, is actually derived from uhuru, which is a Swahili word for freedom.
Isn't that neat?
Yeah. So Nichelle was pretty busy at the time. She also, in between everything, she was also a model. So I just wanted to throw that in there. I mean, I don't think many people knew she was a model.
But who'd be surprised by that? Nobody.
No. Nobody.
Just look at her. She was beautiful. She still is.
She still is.
She still is. For a woman, I think she's in her 80s, and she's radiant.
Absolutely.
Well, she got the job as Uhura, obviously. The worst script that she was ever given was the Corbomite maneuver, where every minute she's turning to Kirk saying, hailing frequencies open, frequencies open, hailing frequencies open. They're open, sir. Hailing frequencies open, Captain. Frequencies open, sir. I mean, that's all they gave her and that was the first episode filmed after the second pilot Where No Man Has Gone Before.
Right.
And I'm sure she had to be shooting that thinking, are you kidding me? Is this it?
Yeah.
And so as the first season, 1966, rolls on, she's beginning to think, I don't know if I want to do this. It's nice. The money's good, but I'm not really contributing. My character's not contributing. They're not really writing for me. And really my biggest line in most episodes is, hailing frequencies open, sir.
Yeah.
But yet here she was, and she didn't quite understand this. She was part of the command crew, part of the leaders on this multiracial crew, and she was a leading actor as a black woman in 1966. Unprecedented in TV. And in fact, nobody else in TV who looked like her had a role like that. All of the other roles for black women were servants at that time. She really, really was in a breakout role. She just didn't realize it. So she became sort of tempted to leave. She began to think, well, maybe I'll go back to Broadway. Maybe I'll go back to singing and dancing.
Well, why wouldn't she?
Right. Why wouldn't you? She considers herself a serious actor, And then you just sort of take what you had said about her and her family earlier, that they never really felt put down by anyone. Right?
Right.
She's not feeling that way. She's just thinking, this isn't the best role for me. I'm going to go find something better.
Yep.
She actually went into Roddenberry somewhere in 1966 and said, I think I'm going to leave. I don't think this is right for me. And Roddenberry was like, really? Yeah, I've kind of made up my mind. You know, I just don't think this is going to work. That weekend, that was on a Friday, that weekend she was at an NAACP fundraiser. And she's meeting people and they're talking, and someone taps her on the shoulder and says, there's a really big fan here in the room that would like to meet you. And she thought, okay. And she turned, and it was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Really?
And so he comes up with this big grin on his face. And he says, I'm a big fan of yours. And in fact, I'm a big fan of Star Trek. It is the only show that we let our young children stay up to watch.
Wow.
She was kind of real surprised by that. Yeah. And so she responded and said, well, I'm actually leaving the show. I've kind of made up my mind and I'm going to leave the show. And he replied, you can't. You're part of history. Dr. King told her that she needed to stay on the show because her character was a role model for black children and young women across the country. Her role was telling, black kids and women, you can be a prominent professional, just like this character. It was creating, you talk about visioning and visualization. There it was, right in front of people to see not only a woman, but a black woman being in a command situation.
And as we talked, just being a woman is one thing, but being a black woman at the time?
Right. And clearly she was an equal. She was treated with respect. She wasn't talked down to. I mean, I remember a scene, something had knocked out the communications, and Spock was kind of like, hey, come on, Uhura, we need this up and running. He didn't say it like that. Those are my words. And she said, I'm trying, Mr. Spock, but these instruments, they're really tough and they're really in bad shape or something like that. And Spock replies, and I can think of no one better suited to do it than you, Miss Uhura.
Yeah.
That told every viewer how important that character was to that show. And it didn't matter that she was a black woman. So this conversation with Dr. King really sinks in with her. And she went back to work on Monday. And she went into Gene's office and she said, you know what, I think I'm going to stay. And here's why. And she told Gene the story about Dr. King and meeting Dr. King. And he cried. She writes in her book that he was so affected by that he cried, that it meant that much to him. So that's kind of a big deal when you think about Star Trek. A lot of people, Star Trek, yeah, we know it's a big entertainment franchise, whatever. But when you start thinking about it on that level, holy crap, this is significant stuff.
Well, what bigger honor can you have at the time?
Right.
I can't think of any.
I can't.
And for both Gene and for Nichelle.
I can't really either. To have the leader of the civil rights movement tell you, you're a role model, you're important, that's a big deal.
It sure is.
That's a big deal. So it was also around this time, and I just wanted to because here's another story about her and Gene. Obviously, they were still talking and they were still close. There came a point where Gene told Nichelle that he had to fight with NBC to keep her on the show. And this was kind of interesting because in other works, this story, like in other books and things, this story is told. Joel Engel, in his book, in his biography about Gene, he writes, maybe he was just trying to curry favor with her or get her to be more loyal to him, because long before Star Trek had hit the air, NBC, in letters to the shows that were in production for the network, was encouraging them to have more non-white faces. There's NBC also trying to put African-American executives at this time in the mid-'60s. Like, NBC's trying to do the right thing. It seemed a bit out of place that he would have to fight with NBC to keep a black woman on the show. So whether or not that story is true about him having to fight for her, that's kind of a question mark.
Interesting.
Yeah, right. In 1967, in January, Nichelle was featured on the cover of Ebony magazine. That's a big deal. And she was wearing her red uniform. And that was the first of 5 other times that she would be in the magazine. And that was a big honor to be in the magazine, that magazine at that time. In 1968, she married a man by the name of Duke Mundy. They stayed married until 1972. Of course, we know in 1968, that was a big moment in television history. During the episode Plato's Stepchildren, Nichelle and William Shatner shared the first interracial on-screen kiss. She tells this story in her 1994 autobiography that she received a letter from a white Southerner who wrote, I'm not really big on mixing the races. And here's a quote, though. He says, however, anytime a red-blooded American boy like Captain Kirk gets a beautiful dame in his arms that looks like Uhura, he ain't going to fight it, unquote.
It's awesome.
That is awesome. It is. One of her biggest regrets about Star Trek was that she never got to be in a command position. Sulu took command of the ship at times, and Scotty did. She never got to, and she always thought that, wow, what an impact that would have made in the 60s to have given command to Lieutenant Uhura at some time. And it would have been. It would have really sort of put a major capstone on that show if that had happened. So we know the show goes off the air in 1969. And I was looking at her IMDb profile. In the 70s, she has 48 different acting credits after Star Trek. But only 13 of them are non-Trek related. That's interesting. And of course, this is running all the way up through 2017. So that tells me, man, she really embraced her role as Lieutenant Uhura. And she sort of let it take her wherever it was going to take her. In the early 70s, after the show went off the air, she appeared on shows like Insight, The DA, Truck Turner. I've never heard of that show, but I like the title. Then, of course, in 1973 comes the animated series, and she revoiced her character. But then she didn't act from the end of the animated series throughout the rest of the 70s until she appeared in the motion picture. Now, that could be for a number of reasons, because I know there were times as Star Trek was moving from a motion picture to a smaller, TV movie to a TV series to the motion picture again, that they would sign the actors to different contracts to hold them. And so perhaps it was just that she was held under contract, she received the money, she didn't have to work, and life was good. And It was also a time when she was working for another entity, NASA. And we'll talk more about her work for NASA here in just a moment. In the 80s, she only had 7 acting credits, 3 of which were non-Star Trek roles. So she really did commit to being Lieutenant Uhura and going with it. As I mentioned, in 1976, she joined her castmates for the christening of the first space shuttle, the Enterprise. That's a really, really big deal. And it sort of marks the beginning of her involvement with NASA as well. At this time, NASA was made up of really just white men. There were no women. There were very few minorities. During this period, she had said to something, and this had gotten reported, she had said something like, quote, "Not in this day and age. We just absolutely cannot have that. I cannot be part of that," unquote. And that statement got back to NASA. And they said, okay, can we hire you to help us recruit women and minorities? And she said yes. And so for a decade or so, she worked for NASA. Her job was to do just that. Find women, find minorities, and bring them into NASA.
Wow.
She actually recruited some really big names that a lot of people would know. Dr. Sally Ride, who was the first American female astronaut. Colonel Guion Bluford, the first African-American astronaut, as well as Judith Resnick and Dr. Ron McNair. And those are names that people know. They went up on successful shuttle missions, but then they also both died in the Challenger accident in 1986.
Right.
She also recruited Charles Bolden. He became the first African-American administrator for NASA, the head of NASA. That's kind of a big deal.
Now, she recruited him, and he worked his way up to be...
Yeah, I think he flew like on 6 shuttle missions, and then he got into the administrative side, and then rose to become the head of NASA.
Wow.
I know. And how proud must she be to be able to look at these astronauts that have flown, or to look at Bolden's career as the head of NASA and go, wow, I had a hand in that. I had something to do with that. In the mid-'80s, she became a member of the Board of Governors for the National Space Society. Now, this isn't a well-known group, but it's a nonprofit educational organization that works for the advocacy of space exploration. And a lot of big names are members of this organization, and it was originally created by Wernher von Braun.
I was part of it for a time.
Were you really?
Yeah.
It's a big deal. It's kind of cool. And you know what it's about.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I did it more for the astronomy aspect, but
it's a great group.
It is.
And they constantly are reminding government or reminding NASA that, hey, these are the kinds of things that you should be considering, that we could do. It's not that hard. The objective is easy to reach. So, you need that kind of group from time to time.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Her role in the National Space Society and NASA, it was pretty significant, and it influenced a lot of people to get involved that maybe she didn't recruit either. And one of those was astronaut Mae Jemison. And she has said that, Nichelle's role on Star Trek as Lieutenant Uhura inspired her to become an astronaut. And even Whoopi Goldberg, who was on Star Trek The Next Generation, says that Nichelle Nichols was a huge influence in getting her to be involved in acting. It gave her confidence, to step up as a black woman. But it also got her interested in Star Trek to the point where she loved it so much that she asked to be on Star Trek The Next Generation. And so, obviously, like I said, she, from season 2 on, was Guinan.
Yeah.
And just a little side note, Mae Jemison also appeared on TNG in one episode. So that's kind of a big deal. Nichelle officially played her on the big screen for the last time in 1991. And then we know that movie is Star Trek The Undiscovered Country. Also that year, Gene was dying, and she was deeply impacted by that. Obviously, she owed him this career that she had had. And so she wrote a song for him. And when he did pass, she sang it at his funeral. That's, that shows she's got a big heart for this guy,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. In 1994, she wrote her autobiography, Beyond Uhura, Star Trek and Other Memories. In it, she revealed that she did have an affair, actually, with Gene Roddenberry. We've talked about it here just a few minutes back, but that's when it first came out. It lasted for several years, and it did coincide with Roddenberry's affair with Majel Barrett. So all of that sort of came out in this book. In 1997, this is kind of a sad note, her brother Nicholas was part of the Heaven's Gate cult. And if you don't know that, that was a cult of people waiting for the comet, what is it, Hale-Bopp?
Yeah, Hale-Bopp, right.
And they thought that if they committed suicide at that time, that their souls would rise and they would meet who they needed to meet. I don't know all the details.
Yeah, I think something about it's a spaceship, really, and
inside the comet, right?
Right.
Well, unfortunately, her brother committed suicide at that time, and that's kind of a sad note that happened. But an interesting thing is he wrote a note to his sister saying, "I'm as happy as I've ever been."
Yeah, it's
a hard thing. Yeah, just a tough thing. Exactly. You know, earlier I said that she played Uhura for the last time in 1991 in The Undiscovered Country. She actually played her again in 2007 in a web-based fan-made movie, Star Trek of Gods and Men. So she had a chance to play Uhura again, even though it wasn't a Paramount production.
Did she get a commander role or?
I think she did.
Promoted?
I think she was a commander in that movie. Yeah, she got a promotion.
Finally.
Yeah, absolutely. This is kind of cool. In 2012, she got to meet President Obama. Now, she had read that somewhere that President Obama had said, you know, when growing up, I had a crush on Lieutenant Uhura. And she asked him, and he said, absolutely, I had a crush on you.
Again, who didn't?
Right, who didn't? But how cool to ask the president that, you know, and he kind of confirms it. He says, and actually, I'm a Trekker. I'm a fan. So that was kind of cool, too.
That is cool.
She suffered a mild stroke in 2015, but just a couple of months after that, she rebounded quick and flew aboard NASA's Stratospheric Observatory for Infrared Astronomy. It's also known as SOFIA. And it is a souped-up 747 that carries a 100-inch telescope high on the fringes of space. And for short periods of time, the telescope can look out and view the infrared radiation of stars so they can gather that information, bring it back to Earth, and study it. Well, it's kind of an aggressive ride, if you will. It climbs pretty darn quick and at a pretty steep angle, and then it comes down the same way. But she was there, and she wrote it, and she loved it. And finally, in 2016, she received the Life Career Award from the Academy of Science Fiction, Fantasy, and Horror Films. And it was presented as part of the 42nd Saturn Awards ceremony. You know, I just want to say that I think Star Trek, without Lieutenant Uhura and Nichelle Nichols playing her, would have been something less. It wouldn't have had the same impact on our culture. And I, for one, I'm really glad she was part of the show.
Absolutely, I agree.
Do you have any favorite Kirk moments from Star Trek?
We sure do, and we're going to tell you what they are next week.
Thanks for listening to 70s Trek, an independent fan production. Join us next week as we explore more about the production, the actors, the producers, and the influencers of Star Trek in the lost decade of the 1970s on 70s Trek.